Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar in the KaiNexus Continuous Improvement webinar series. I'm Mark Graben. I'm going to be your host and moderator today for a presentation titled Becoming the Change, Leadership Behavior Strategies for Continuous Improvement in Healthcare. And I'm really excited that we're joined by Kim Barnas. She is the CEO of Catalysis. And we're also joined by John Toussaint, who is the chairman of that organization. You can learn more about Catalysis at createvalue.org. So I want to introduce Kim and John. So prior to her role at Catalysis, Kim served as a senior vice president for a health system, where she had the opportunity to lead and to learn about lean and implementing that work in hospital operations. She started in that path back in 2003 with value stream mapping and improvement events and projects. She led initial value streams for OB and cancer services. And in 2014, she authored a book called Beyond Heroes, a lean management system for healthcare based on this journey. And Kim has a Master's of Science degree in healthcare administration. And we're also joined by Dr. John Toussaint. He's an internist. He's a former healthcare CEO and is one of the foremost figures globally, I would add, in the adoption of organizational excellence principles in healthcare. He founded Catalysis, which is a nonprofit education institute, in 2008. And Catalysis has launched peer-to-peer learning networks. They develop and deliver in-depth workshops and many products, including books, DVDs, and webinars. And John has written 3 books, all of which have received the prestigious Shingo Research and Publication Award. They're On the Mend, Potent Medicine, and Management on the Mend. So I'll hand it over to the two of you. That sets up no pressure at all for the new book that's coming out, of course. But I'm sure this is going to be well received. And thank you for what you're going to share today.
Well, thank you, Mark. We're excited to be able to share some of the thinking we have in our new book. And it's always a great opportunity to do that with you and your organization. So today we're going to talk about the book, but specifically we're going to focus on the personal transformation that a lean leader needs to go through to really sustain long-term transformation. So it's been interesting for us as we've written this book to codify our thinking and for John and I to do it together and learn from each other. But one of the things that became pretty clear in the beginning is that we have used a lot of really significant thinking, lean tools, lean management, putting together systems together, using the Shingo model to think about behaviors. But when we really stopped and stepped back and looked at what was happening after these many years of our work, we recognized that without a leadership change, a personal leadership change, sustainment is not occurring. And so we learned about this by talking to hundreds of leaders. You know, we've been working around the world for many years. We've been coaching in Europe, in the US, Canada, Brazil, South Africa, and the problem seems to be universal. And the problem begins with the challenge for us as an executive is to move from knowing conceptually to practicing personally. So when we actually talk today about the personal A3 and the executive assessment, we're talking about a deeply personal change for the transformation, leading the way by changing yourself first as you expect others to change their behavior. So this personal transformation really involves identifying strengths and opportunities different than we've seen in the past. And so we're going to talk about this in 2 different levels. We're going to talk about this assessment tool, which I'm going to focus on, and then John's going to talk more deeply about how we use this assessment in the personal A3. When we talk about the personal A3, I can't help but stop and say thank you to Margie Hagney, who is the groundbreaker on this personal A3, developed these materials, has been teaching and sharing them with us for years, and with Carl Hoover, who joined John to actually develop this assessment. And finally, thanking the Shingo Institute for their great work that we have built upon. So today, I'm going to talk specifically about this leadership self-assessment. And again, this is a personal self-assessment that we start all of our engagements for executive coaching with. And we also teach it in our CEO forum. So we've done hundreds of these, and we know that this tool is one of the best tools we have found to help people think about where their strengths and opportunities exist, and then to actually create observable behaviors to make those changes. So this is set up in a unique way. If you see at the top, you've got willingness, and then you have humility, curiosity, perseverance, and self-discipline. These are traits or dimensions that we really think are important in terms of your willingness to have a sincere talk with yourself about how am I doing in these areas. The purple behaviors beneath them are really the behaviors that we can observe and that we can help coach to that support this. So I'm going to walk through the dimensions and then the reinforcing behaviors so that you understand more deeply what they are. When you're using this tool, which, by the way, you can get from the book, we have all of our tools in the book, and you can download it from the createvalue.org site. So this tool is available to all of you. But when you look at how you rate yourself, if you rate yourself a 1, you're pretty much saying that I don't exhibit this behavior. It's rare or underdeveloped. If you rate yourself a 2, you have some awareness. You may use it irregularly. You may experiment with it. A 3 means that you're fairly frequent in your use of this behavior. 4 is that you consistently use it. And 5 is sort of like you unconsciously, permanently, uniformly, maturely use it. So that's how we actually go about rating it. So when we start with that first dimension of willingness, you say willingness to do what? It's willingness to change, willingness to learn. We all know that as we move organizations through improvement transformations, the willingness of the leaders is incredibly important. So we ask each person to rate themselves on that 1 to 5 scale. How willing are you to change? Are you a continuous learner? Do you want to continue to learn? And most people will rate themselves a 3 or a 4, that they're looking at new programs because they want to change, they want to make improvements. But then we ask, the reinforcing behavior we observe for people is how do you use reflection in your as one of your tools in your arsenal? Do you reflect on your work and your impact of your work on your employees, your peers, your board, your community? And if you do, how do you do that? Carl taught me that doing it in the shower or driving home does not count. We actually need to see, do you have time in your calendar with reflection that is substantial, consistent, and reproducible? And do you have questions to reflect upon? So John and I often tell people that there's 2 questions to start with. One is, what did I do to unleash the creativity of my people today? And what did I do that got in their way? And so, reflection becomes a key element in any transformation. Most of our learning occurs when we're willing to look at ourselves and reflect on how we make a difference in our organization. The next element is humility. And, if you rate yourself a 5 on humility, I tell people then you're not. But humility is more than just having humility as your lifestyle. It's more about how do you demonstrate it? How do you go to the Gemba? How do you talk to your people? How do you ask questions? Do you tell them the answer? Do you interrupt them? What does it look like when you're present with your people? So the reinforcing behavior for humility is go and see, listen, and learn. So when you go and see, what do you do when you go and see? What kind of questions do you ask? Are you asking open-ended questions that let people celebrate their great work? Do you ask them to teach you? Are you open to learning? When they're talking, are you listening to them or are you talking over them? Can you reiterate something that you learned each time you go to the Gemba? Those behaviors really resonate with your teams. I have to make a little segue here and say, when you start doing this, you need to tell people that you're practicing a new behavior, because it also scares them if they don't understand that you're reflecting on your behavior. This has nothing to do with them. It has to do with your learning. So do you go and see? Do you go and talk to your people with humility? The next dimension is curiosity. Are you really curious about what people do? Are you curious about how what they do affects your organization? How do you know what they're thinking? How do you demonstrate to them that you care about what they're thinking? Are you open to changing, and are you curious about other ways of doing things that you have currently done in one method in the past? And the way you demonstrate that curiosity is by, again, going to the Gemba, asking good questions, asking questions that are open-ended, that don't have a yes or a no. And my other two rules about asking questions is they should not be about who or why to start with. They really need to be about what and how. Asking questions that let people teach you demonstrates your curiosity, and it reinforces that humility and willingness to change with your team. So being present and asking good questions is important. Then when you're asking those questions, are you an effective listener, or are you just waiting to speak? When you're listening, can you reflect back to them what they're saying? Are you asking the right questions and hearing their answers and really paying attention? And then are you doing that with an A3 thinking method in your mind? Do you really want to understand the background of the situation? Are you curious about the current situation and how we got there? Are you curious about what management may have done to put us in the current state, and what management can do to help us get out of the current state and onto the next future state? Do you analyze what they're thinking? Are you using A3 thinking, not an A3 template, but A3 thinking in your conversations as you are curious about what your teams are learning, doing, and improving? And then are you celebrating with them with how you ask questions and that effective listening? Do you reinforce their behavior with your curiosity? The next element is perseverance. And as all of us in management know, perseverance is really something that is important to just surviving and getting by. When you're in a continuous improvement methodology, you know that there is going to be failure, and you need to celebrate that failure and persevere through it. And to do that, the two reinforcing behaviors that become really key and really important is, do you have a buddy or a partner in your organization that you share your thinking with, that can reflect to you what they're seeing as well as what you're seeing, that you can have those deep, curious conversations, and that they can, in fact, help you with your reflection and say, you know, when you showed up at Gemba today, it was really great that you were there, but do you know when you told them what to do, that probably shut down their learning? Do you have a buddy or a partner that you can be vulnerable with, that you can share your thinking with, and that has enough trust that they can tell you and reflect back to you what they're actually seeing? The second reinforcing behavior of that perseverance is having a coach. A coach is someone that's in a much more formal relationship with you, that understands those things in your personal A3 that you're working on, and that can help you and push at how you continue moving forward. So a coach and a buddy or partner are essential elements in sustaining the perseverance to get the breakthrough that you're looking for in your improvement processes. And then the last element, trait or discipline, is self-discipline. And everybody I talk to rates themselves low here. It seems that self-discipline is something that we all want to have, and we all recognize that we don't always follow our own processes. So the self-discipline is reinforced by the use of leader's standard work. Most of us have some leader's standard work, whether we've got it written down or not. But by writing it down and adding to it as you learn, you become more disciplined in your approach. Saying, I'm going to reflect twice a week for 15 minutes, and I'm going to use a journal. And putting that in your standard work makes it real. And then putting it from your standard work into your calendar makes it real. Recognizing that I'm going to demonstrate humility by going to the Gemba becomes part of your standard work. And you say, I'm going to go to Gemba on these 2 days a week, and this is what I'm going to look for. And I'm going to go to Gemba with purpose. I'm going to either go to celebrate or to understand a process. So standard work becomes kind of the glue that holds a lot of this all together. So at this point, I think it's important to look at, here's an example of how someone rated themselves on their standard work. And John's going to talk about the person that actually did this rating and how you take this tool, use it in your current state, and move on with your personal A3 development plan.
Thanks, Kim and Mark.
So the radar chart's really important from the standpoint of self-reflection, and again, reinforcing this concept that is self-reflection. This is, we are our own best and worst critics, and so a process to be able to reflect on how we're doing and then help to take us to where we want to be is really powerful, and we've found this to be true now with many CEOs and senior executives throughout the world. So what is the overall then way that we can sort of hold ourselves accountable or responsible for making some changes? And that's where this personal improvement A3 comes to bear. And I'm going to walk through this conceptually with you. Basically, it's A3 thinking, only it's applied to you as personally. And there are different questions on this A3 format. For example, we're not talking about a problem, we're talking about an opportunity. So what is the opportunity that you want to focus on as you begin to make some changes that you think will provide better leadership for your teams? So let's delve into this personal improvement A3 process. First of all, this is a dynamic document. It's focused on behavior at the individual personal level. And what we many times see is that leaders that start using this process actually keep putting in organizational issues. This is about you as an individual. It's not about your organization. It's going to require that you constantly come back to it, every few weeks or months, multiple iterations, just like any good A3, only now we're looking at it from the standpoint of our own leadership activities and behaviors. And then as you learn new things about yourself, right, we update the A3 just like you would in a problem solving or a strategy A3. You begin to update the personal A3 with new information about your own self-reflection, new information about feedback from a buddy or a coach, those sorts of things. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So why should I improve myself in order to be a coach, a leader who creates an organization full of problem solvers? So that's the background. Why would you want to make any changes in what you do as a leader? What are the habits that I have now in the current state? This is where the radar chart actually fits is right into the current state, right? So here are some habits. Here are some things that may be pulled in on that radar chart. And here's some things I want to do differently. Then what's the opportunity? In other words, if I'm looking out 6 months or a year from now, what are the things that I want to see different in myself? And then what's the goal? What's our target? What am I trying to achieve here as a leader? Why do I act the way I do in the analysis phase? So, what's your belief system? What's the reasons for some of the things that you do now? And then what are the experiments and the follow-up in the plan and the follow-up that we're going to use to decide if we're actually improving in our leadership skills? So that's the template. And what I want to do is go through a specific example. You can't read the details here. I'm going to go through each box with you. This is a specific example with a very, very good executive that I had the privilege of coaching for a while. His name is Al Pilong. He's now the CEO of Novant Health. When we worked with him, he was in Michigan. And he allowed me to show his personal A3 to a lot of different people. So I'm going to walk through this with you. First of all, we want to date this thing, right? Just like any other A3, a problem-solving A3, we date it, we title it, we put the draft number on there. And so the title is important, and because this is like any A3, the title tells you what the purpose is. So in this case, the chief operating officer who we're studying today, his title was My Personal Leadership Development Journey. And his version was version 3. So he really just started this whole process when I documented his work. So let's look at the background. Why should I improve myself to be a coach, leader who creates an organization filled with problem solvers? Why this and why now? So personal change is critical to changing behavior. Organizations don't change until leaders do. The personal A3 is the self-reflection mechanism for that to happen. And then, what is the burning platform that we're trying to establish as we look at the background here of the organization? So in Mr. Pilong's case, it was because the challenges facing our organization and our industry, and this is certainly true today during COVID, demand transformation, which requires complete alignment up and down the organization. So my chief role is to be an effective coach for my team so they can coach and develop problem solvers. And the only way to sustain change is to engage everyone in the process. So even back when we did this, there was so much change going on that it was clear that there's no way that this one person could make all the decisions. So it became very clear that unless he could develop a system of coaching that would allow folks to identify and solve problems on their own, that it was not going to be sustainable over time. And in the current state, so what are the personal habits and actions? When you do this work, the radar chart is a great way to identify some things, but also what's going well, right? This isn't just about things that you want to improve. This is what's going well. Many of us have completed StrengthsFinder or another type of organizational development process where we learn, what we're good at. Well, we also want to put that in this document because what we're good at is probably what we're going to keep being good at. And if we can improve on something we're already good at, that's another way to look at this. So these are habits that you want to change, but they're also habits that you want to make even more powerful for you as a leader. So, to summarize Al's position on the current state, it was I tend to do things rather than coach others to do. Frankly, it's, as we all know, it's sometimes easier just to do it ourselves, right? But if we're trying to unleash the creativity of everyone and get people to really help us understand and solve problems, we're going to have to act differently. And that's exactly what he's saying here. So his opportunity statement, not the problem statement, remember, opportunity statement, my comfort with doing the improvement myself versus aligning, enabling others to do the improvement is resulting in little organizational change. Sound familiar? Certainly, most of us have been there. And in this case, it was driving him nuts. So he was personally frustrated, burned out. Everybody was coming with all the problems to his office. It's like, time out, I can't do all this. So unless I change, this environment is not going to get any better. So what does good look like for Al then? So I need more focus on developing and coaching others in the transformation journey. So that process of becoming a coach was really sort of the target condition in this case, that personal process of becoming a coach. And this is the interesting part. So why do these behaviors exist, right? Now, Mr. Pilong was a pharmacist, so I'm a physician. We come from different backgrounds, but in many cases, when we come from the scientific side of where we actually are trained to be the problem solvers, when we get into management positions, it becomes much more difficult because now our job is not to solve the problems; it's to create the systems and the behaviors that allow the people on the ground to solve the problems. And in this case, the analysis was, well, it's just easier to do it myself. I like the positive personal feedback, right? I mean, we as clinicians got into this work because we wanted to help people. And then part of that helping people is to, make decisions, make diagnoses, and then, get a pat on the back. then also, as we've looked at the analysis of these personal behaviors on his part, there was no standard. There was no disciplined approach to coaching. In fact, coaching wasn't even part of the executive mindset. And because of that, the leaders were not having the difficult conversations around what are we trying to build in our organization from a development standpoint, people development standpoint. So the analysis section of the A3 is very important because it really gets at sort of those core beliefs or things that have been instilled in us that are maybe getting in the way of some of the things that we need to do differently. So the experiments that we're going to run, right? What experiments will I try to become a better coach and leader of problem solvers? So this was his decision. Develop and implement a standard template. You heard from Kim about standard work, right? A lot of the issues that we have as leaders can be walked back to the fact that we don't have standard work for what we're doing. So what he did was he created a standard template for meetings, which was focused on, not the problem of the day, but actually a coaching process for his subordinates. So he was going to use his one-on-ones with his subordinates as coaching opportunities. He was going to get to the Gemba with each of these leaders. And he had, 20 or 25 direct reports. So that's why he couldn't do it more than quarterly. And they were spread out a large geography. But the point was, I've got to get to the Gemba, which is another opportunity for me to coach the folks that report to me. And then finally, I'm going to create a reflection process. Kim talked about a journal, some way in which we're capturing, how we're doing every week. What did I do that really worked, and what did I do that didn't work in terms of, unleashing the creativity of my team. Then we created a plan, right? So what steps were we going to take? Well, in Al's case, it was develop the template, right? So he did that. Implement these discussions one-on-one with a focus on coaching. Schedule a reflection time, and that's important. It's not in the shower, like Kim said. It's not in the car. It's reflection time on your calendar that's purposeful. And then he worked with his assistants to set up the Gemba. Follow-up, important part of the A3, right? So how do I know I'm improving? Well, in this case, he thought I could get feedback from reports. Now, I'll tell you what, my experience about getting feedback from my direct reports was pretty miserable. They didn't really feel comfortable giving me direct feedback. So you can try, and maybe if you've built a trusting relationship with them, they'll do that. But it's pretty tough. The power distance makes that difficult. How will I know I'm off plan? Okay, again, our best and worst critics is ourselves. So if we have a good reflection process, we're going to be able to step back and think about what went well and what could be even better if. And then how will I make time to practice? In Al's case, it was put it on the schedule, becomes part of my standard work. What's the process for ongoing reflection? He said that was journaling. And then who else will I involve? So he did involve his boss, and he involved me. I was coaching him at that time, and we set up a process where he could get some of the feedback that he was after. So as you can tell, this is really a very personal process. And that's the important part to remember here. This is not about the organization. This is about you. And as you work with the radar chart, which you can download from the link that you'll get in our new book, and also you can download this personal A3 template as well. You really need to think about this as how I'm going to use this to improve my leadership actions and behaviors. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mark for Q&A.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Kim. And we're going to have a generous Q&A session here. So we never get feedback that says Q&A was too long. People usually want more. So I encourage people, please do continue submitting questions, and we'll take full advantage of that. But before we do so, a couple quick announcements. I want to tell you about upcoming webinars as we continue the KaiNexus series. If you can advance that, please. And all of that contact info are in the slides that you'll be able to get. So for KaiNexus customers only, our monthly training team office hours with Adam and Matt is coming up again on August 27th. But then our next presentation webinar, which is open to everybody, it's going to be presented September 15th, 1 o'clock, usual time. It's going to be titled Leading with Respect, Standard Work for Frontline Leaders. It's going to be presented by Didier Rubino from Value Capture. He's worked in healthcare for quite a while now and has a background in industry. And he's going to be co-presenting with a client, Jennifer Ashley, from the Sutter Valley Medical Foundation. And so I think, as we saw in today's webinar, even though they're working in healthcare, there are general lessons we think everybody doing this type of work can learn from. So you can register for those at kainexus.com/webinars. We want to also invite you, if you can advance it, please, to check out the webinar on-demand library. Today's webinar will end up there as well. So if you go to kainexus.com/webinars and click on the right-hand side where it says on-demand library, you can go there. We also invite you to check out our blog at blog.kainexus.com. And then final announcement is to let you know about our podcast series. You can go to kainexus.com/podcast, or you can find us, just search KaiNexus on Apple Podcasts or wherever you find your podcasts. The audio of today's session will go into the podcast feed. As always, if you're a subscriber, you may have heard the preview podcast that we did with Kim and John a couple of days ago. So we encourage you to subscribe, and please rate and review the podcasts. And so with that, we'll do the Q&A, and we'll put up contact info here and a reminder about the upcoming book, Becoming the Change. So first question, you talk about individual personal transformation, and you talk about changing yourself first. Have you seen organizations where the first thing that they do with Lean is that executive personal A3 before they teach A3 problem solving to the rest of the organization? And if you haven't seen that, what would you expect if that was an organization's approach?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. When we engage with a senior leadership team, actually the first thing we do is the personal A3. That's how we actually introduce A3. And I think what's interesting is that when you do it personally, it helps to embed that thinking process for as you begin to expand to use A3 thinking in everything you do. So we've been very encouraged, actually, when we have begun using the personal A3 process to actually introduce A3 thinking. And it seems to be a very effective way for people not only to begin to understand what they need to change, but also what they want to change. But then also, how do we use this thinking process for everything?
I agree. I think it's been very powerful to use that with the team for two reasons. One, they're experimenting with a tool, the A3, and they're also telling the organization that their behavior change is as important as everyone else's. So when we start with that, or in tandem have A3 thinking being taught throughout the organization, it complements each other very nicely.
There's I think kind of a related follow-up question. What you're describing here with the personal A3 and reflection is a great example of leaders leading by example. A lot of organizations are still in a point where leaders delegate Lean or try to delegate transformation. So what are your thoughts, and John and Kim, either what would you share from your own experiences being senior leaders at a health system and a hospital level? What do you see in other organizations? How can we move more in that direction of leading by example?
I think we wrote this book because we've seen lots of examples where people have delegated lean and that they've made initial progress. They've made some fabulous initial progress using projects and value stream mapping and using the tools. But once they turn their head away from that and move on to the next project, the sustainment doesn't remain. And so we recognize that the culture changes more than using lean tools and lean thinking. It's supporting it with the appropriate behavior.
It's definitely about behaviors, and I think that you have to. I think the question is how do you engage leaders that aren't engaged, and that's a very difficult question. But what I always tell folks is that you have a certain span of control in your organization. Within that span of control, you can model the way. And as you model the way and you unleash the creativity and the excitement and the energy of the people that work in the areas you're responsible for, you're going to see great results. And maybe that's going to get noticed by some leaders. Maybe there'll be there'll be interest because somehow you are getting better results than everyone else. So I think this works at all levels, and depending on where you are in an organization, you still can model the way and get great results.
I've got another question. This is a question from Rachel. Have you ever had a leader share their personal A3 with their team in a public forum?
That's a great question. And Susan Ehrlich at San Francisco General Hospital, when we first introduced this to her several years ago, she actually decided to post her radar chart and personal A3 on her door to her office. And what followed after that was that every other leader there did the same thing, right? Again, she was modeling the way. So I think it's perfectly appropriate to share where you're at with both your self-reflection and the things you're working on. This is a learning journey for all of us. And there's no right or wrong. There's no, I'm better than you. There are always things that we can learn and improve on. And I think the more we can be transparent about what we're working on, like Kim said in her talk, it's like if we explain that up front to people, that we're really trying to do something new and different that hopefully is going to be lead to better results, then what's wrong with that transparency? I mean, I think we've seen that be a very positive thing.
And I think we've seen it more than with Susan. Susan's was one of the first, but when we go to South Africa, Mr. Dubé posted his along with his radar chart, and he thought it was part of his accountability, not just transparency. He wanted people to know what he was working on. He asked all of his direct reports, he took these materials and he taught it to them, and they put theirs on their board. And then they taught it to their directors. And so when you go and visit that hospital, you see these radar charts and these personal A3s all over the place. And many also use it to start building that leader's standard work. And so you'll also start to see them posting standard work. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon when people really understand it and start talking about it and sharing it with each other and become vulnerable and open to the rest of their team. Their learning just is exponential.
And we've seen this in other industries. I mean, I visited some Danaher companies, for example, that have done something similar to this, not necessarily with the templates that we've shown you today, but the point is being transparent about what the top leaders are working on from a personal improvement perspective.
And it's apropos you mentioned Mr. Dubé, because we had a question that came in from Emmanuel, who's in Sierra Leone. And he said this program seems it would be very important for African leaders. He's interested in the application of this, how it would extend in Africa. So you've already touched on that, but maybe we can expand the question. And if you have other thoughts about coaching leaders in countries outside of the U.S.
But, it's interesting. Kim and I have had about 2.5 years of experience now coaching African leaders in public hospitals and in South Africa in particular, in Johannesburg and in Cape Town. And what we found is that there are many really committed leaders in that country, and they have very few resources. And because they have very few resources, they have to rely on their own ingenuity to actually get things to work. And so taking these concepts in the personal A3 and radar chart into the Laretong Hospital in Johannesburg and into the Charlotte Maxexi Hospital in Johannesburg, those two leaders, Gladys Bogashi and Mr. Dubé, were able to really change the culture of their hospitals. And it didn't require big, fancy consultants coming in every week. They simply, we were on the phone with them once a month, walking through this in a virtual coaching way, and they took it and ran with it. And it's one of the more impressive things I've seen. And I think it's very applicable. One of the reasons we ran this experiment is that, we're a not-for-profit education institute. We're trying to really transform the healthcare industry around the world. And we really wanted to focus in on a country that had, few resources to see, do these ideas actually work in that kind of setting? And what we found, at the Laretong Hospital, there was a 42% reduction in neonatal intensive care unit deaths. They went from 13 mothers dying a year to 0. Same kinds of results at the Charlotte Hospital, where they would go from 13% infection rates in the orthopedic unit to 0.04, using staff ideas, simple things, but allowing the staff to create systems that allow for better patient results. And it's all, traced back to how those leaders behaved in the action. So this is absolutely applicable to, developing economy nations. And I would highly recommend that, you use it in Sierra Leone or wherever.
And you mentioned Gladys Bogashi and Gray Dubé. Thanks to your connections and introductions, I was able to do podcast interviews with each of them in 2019. So I've put links in the chat if anyone wants to hear more directly from them. So let's see. Lots of good questions. Here is a question from Gallon. What are some options for increasing the feedback we get if your reports are hesitant to give feedback? Can you talk more about that? How to create that environment where it feels safe to do so?
I think that's a scary thing. I'll let John respond more detailed, but in terms of getting a response from your direct reports, to get to a point where there's a trusting relationship with them requires you to exhibit a lot of the behaviors we just talked about. When they're fearful of reprisal or that they're going to get a negative reaction or response on their performance review, they're not going to be likely to share their true thinking with you. They're going to tell you all the great things and they're going to avoid any of the opportunities. So I think it's being upfront about why you're asking the questions, what it is you're trying to learn. Ask them for one thing that they think that you might be able to work on rather than tell me everything I could do better. And then, being sure that you reinforce positively those comments. But my true response is that you won't get a whole lot out of that. You get more from the peer or the buddy that can observe you in the Gemba, having the conversations, understanding what it is you're trying to work on, giving you that real feedback. So that for me has always proven to be a stronger link.
Yeah, I think that if you do something positive, people will recognize that. What I've seen is what I've observed is when the leader is really changing, people say something to them about it. They say, I noticed that you're not talking over me, or I've noticed. So I do think that you can get positive feedback from your subordinates, and that's good feedback, right? Because if they're noticing some change in your actions and behavior, and that is actually impacting them in a positive way, then you should be getting some of that positive reaction. If what you're doing is not impacting them in a positive way, then you probably aren't going to get anything, because they're not going to tell you the bad stuff, but they will tell you the good stuff. And so I've looked at the feedback piece as, if I'm making some progress, I probably should get some positive comments. And if I'm not, then I got to step back and ask why.
The one person I think of that really addressed this was Eric Dixon. He's the CEO at UMass, and he talked a lot about, he's a trauma physician, and that in a situation he can get into a trauma mindset where he tells people, and he moves into command and control. And he recognized that through reflection, and he asked his leadership team to call him on it, and that he would always say thank you. And he tells some really wonderful stories that I can't repeat because I don't really know all the details, but about how being in a meeting and he gets upset and he moves into that mode and he looks at the people that he's asked to help him, and they have codes of, you need to calm down. We need to look at this in a different way. And he always stops and thanks them personally for taking the risk of sharing that. And so he made that promise up front, and he lives by it. So he's the one example where I know that it actually was helpful, and he had a process around it.
Yeah. Anyway, I just want to give a quick glimpse into KaiNexus. I think we're blessed to have humble leaders, our senior leadership team, our co-founders, Greg and Matt. And, Greg's an ER doc, and he doesn't get into that, that trauma mode. But, Greg and Matt and Jeff, our head of sales, they go through once a year a reverse evaluation process where they invite the company to give feedback. And that's evolving because that's always been done through kind of, send your comments to somebody who blinds them and makes them anonymous. And there's mostly positive feedback that comes through. But I think the next evolution of it, they were talking about, well, should we not make that anonymous? How can we create an environment where people feel safe to give us feedback along the way? And I know that happens, but I think inviting more of that, I think that reflects well on them as leaders. So let's see. So Didier, our presenter, one of our presenters for September 15th, asked about the coaching sessions. What's the typical frequency and duration of those coaching sessions?
It's once a month. And, today, Didier, just like you, it's all virtual. So, but yeah, the coaching sessions we do with executive teams and the ones we've done in the UK and in Africa, we're all once a month. And what we do is we start each session with a review of the personal A3 learning. So, there's other content, obviously, that we're coaching to, but we always go back to the personal A3 first. So what have you learned? What experiments have you tried? And how has that impacted your thinking? And we found that to be very, we don't spend a lot of time on it, but, all the executives realize that for 5 to 10 minutes, we're going to spend time on them personally before we go on to any sort of content knowledge delivery. So once a month has seemed to be pretty appropriate timing.
And within that coaching session, we have our own standard work and our own, guidance. And so each month there is a aspect that we want them to go and practice. They need to go to the Gemba. There are things that we want them to be looking for and coming back and talking about. So even when it's not their personal A3, it is about their personal behavior.
Okay, let's see. There's two related questions. Let me try to combine them. So Roberto asked and Danilo asked something similar. Can you elaborate more on how to measure effective improvements on a personal A3? You mentioned peers. I'm not quite sure. But so let's just leave it at how would you measure effectively? Is that the radar chart, or is there more to it that can be measured to show progress?
Well, what you have to realize with the personal change processes is this is not it's not a scientific measurement, right? This is observational measurement. So that's how we know whether things are changing, as we are observing people and observing behaviors. I can't say, is that a 4.3 or a 2.7 or a 8.2? What I can say is that I observed you at the Gemba when we started, asking questions that included, who and why, and not listening to people. And now, as we've uncovered this, when I go to the Gemba with you, I can observe you to be asking how and what questions, and I can actually see you carefully trying to work through what people are saying, whether it's saying it back to them or asking more humble inquiry questions. So that's why on the radar chart we talk about the observable behaviors. Those things in purple are observable. And over time, the question is, are those observable behaviors changing or not? Now, the reason that we actually have you do a rating of yourself is so that you have you understand where the gap is in terms of what you're doing right now. So if you have no leader standard work, if you have nothing in your calendar that's standard, you're going to rate yourself low. What that does is it helps you to say, that's maybe where I should start to focus, because I don't have any of that. So it's a combination of these observable behaviors, which is why it's so important to have someone that you trust that can actually, give you some feedback on those observable behaviors, whether it's that coach, that trusted person internally or externally who can observe you from time to time, or somebody else, right? But that's, what we're talking about with the personal change work is really around observable activities and actions that you do, not necessarily quantitatable activities.
Okay, we have another question from Alan. It's asking about the book, Becoming the Change. Can you briefly tell us about what other leadership behavior strategies are included in the book?
So we have a whole section on sort of defining purpose and the process behind how you do that, with very detailed examples. So we delve into the X matrix and strategy deployment activities and what are the specific behaviors from a senior executive level that are required. We talk about not only the behaviors, but the content the content knowledge that's going to be needed. We also have divided it into different swim lanes. So like, what are the key behaviors for the PI team, right? And the PI leaders, what are those behaviors that a really great high functioning PI team need to be exhibiting? The senior leaders, we look at that swim lane. We look at the board, what are the behaviors of the board? A lot of our boards could care less about what we're doing. Well, guess what? That's not the right answer. We need to have very specific behaviors associated with board members and what their roles and responsibilities and actions are. So we've tried to divide this into, support functions. How do they act differently? What are the things that they need to do differently, or do to support the work and the frontline workers themselves? What are those core things? So we've tried to divide it into the kind of the organizational swim lanes, and what is different about each one of those swim lanes from a behavior and action standpoint that's required to really build a great organizational excellence culture.
Kim, anything else that you would add? It's kind of a highlight from the book.
I think as I was looking at that and thinking about it this weekend, because I actually got my first copy of the book in my hands, so of course I had to read it in a hard copy. And what I think is important is how you look at hiring people also changes, and how you think about training them and what the processes are. What are your systems for that? Especially, I was thinking about the work that was done at St. Charles and at St. Mary's in Kitchener in terms of how they now select their board members and how they understand the board tenure is usually has an average of 9 to 10 years, where a CEO is usually in their position 5 years. So the board is really going to be involved in hiring your successor. How do you make sure that you maintain the gains that you've made without understanding how that happened? And so the board relationships are so significantly different as we look at sustaining long-term improvement.
So another question here. I think my leadership would greatly benefit from these type of exercises. Do you have any recommendations about how to coach up? How do we get interest in this idea of reflection and self-assessment?
Well, the first step is to hand them a copy of the book, I think. That's why we wrote it. I think attending some of these webinars and podcasts and those sorts of things. Frankly, the most powerful thing I've seen that changes people's minds, CEOs and leaders, is to go see. Unfortunately, right now, we can't go see. We usually have a bunch of site visits that we sponsor to various organizations like the Cleveland Clinic or UMass or San Francisco General, but we can't do that in this time. So we have to figure out different ways to engage the leaders that aren't necessarily there yet. Certainly, Kim and I are very willing to get on the phone and talk to people. We did an experiment this week of doing a virtual Gemba. Maybe we can do some more of that type of thing. But I think that the stimulation of the interest is to start reading, and there's a number of articles on our website at createvalue.org that can help with that. I just published an article a couple months ago in the New England Journal that explains the differences between the Shingo model, the Baldrige criteria, what is lean. Those are the kinds of articles that I think people can sit down and read in 20 minutes or 15 minutes and maybe get a better understanding.
And maybe just final thing as we wrap up here, the Catalysis Healthcare Value Network, Kim, maybe you can talk about this, is experimenting with a virtual Gemba visit for the members of that network. There's a good example of adaptation.
It's interesting because we formed, well, actually John formed the network, and that was the fundamental basis of Catalysis when we were at that time called the Theta Care Center for Healthcare Improvement. And the network began as a peer-to-peer learning opportunity, and that peer-to-peer learning meant they were going to Gemba at each other's sites. And so we had 21 Gembas a year scheduled for just network members, in addition to those where we'd invite CEOs and others. So it's a huge loss for that network to not be able to go and visit with each other and learn how to coach and how to ask questions and how to see what others are doing and steal shamelessly and bring back ideas. So we've been working on what does a virtual Gemba need to include. And so our first experiment is this week with Torrance. We've run a couple of experiments in Europe in Finland. And one of the things we're learning is the preparation for that Gemba needs to be much different, that people need to understand what their role is virtually. And so those experiments are rapid cycle improvements, and we're going to be doing the first big one this week. I think we have over 100 people coming to Gemba, which is huge. So
very cool.
We'll keep you informed.
Yeah. Well, good. Experiments around the network is one of the themes at the annual summit. So here's a new experiment with the network, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we're at the top of the hour, or actually we are a little bit past. So we will wrap up. But I want to thank all of our attendees. I want to thank everybody for a lot of people, vast majority of people staying on for the Q&A. So thank you for that. And John and Kim, thank you both for the presentation and for sharing so much here during the Q&A. It seemed like that added value to people. They stayed on. So
thank you.
So again, John Toussaint and Kim Barnas from Catalysis, I really do suggest you go check out their website, createvalue.org. And whether you work in healthcare or other industries, there's a lot to be learned from their upcoming book, Becoming the Change, Leadership Behavior Strategies for Continuous Improvement in Healthcare, but I think there'll be a good audience outside of healthcare as well. So thank you, everyone, for attending. We'll see you on September 15th for our next webinar. And everyone be well. Thanks.